Having a segregated home or small business network is arguably the most important thing you could do for overall security. And with UniFi equipment, it's about as easy as it gets to set up a powerful network. But networking isn't the easiest subject to understand, and when you start hearing about things like VLANs, VPNs, IDS and IPS, and a bunch of other stuff, it gets even more confusing for beginners. So in this video, we're going to set up a new home network, but we're going to do it from a beginner's perspective. And this will be the first of multiple videos on this topic. We'll cover everything from the initial setup to adoption, VLANs, Wi-Fi configuration, and even get a little into security, though that will be reserved for a future video. The goal is to help you understand what some of these settings mean so that you can customize them to your environment and have a powerful segregated network. So to start from the very beginning, you have to plug your modem into your router. I'll be using a UniFi Dream Machine Pro Max, but the process will be the same for whichever device you're using. If you have a combination modem and router from your ISP, you'll have to put it into bridge mode, but I don't have one, so I won't be able to show you that. If you don't do that, you'll be in a double NAT situation, which basically means that you have a router plugged into a router, and each of them will have their own firewall, which will cause problems for port forwarding and thus VPNs. The goal is to remove that, so you want the modem plugged directly into the UniFi router. As soon as you do that, download and launch the UniFi mobile application, sign in with your Ubiquiti account, and the device should pop right up. From there, it's a basic setup process where you'll have to select a name, it'll run a speed test, and then you'll be at the point where I'm at, which is logged into the UniFi Site Manager under the account that I use to configure the device. Okay, so this is the UniFi Site Manager. All I did was set up the router on my mobile device, and then I connected to the UniFi Site Manager, and the UDM Pro Max here is what I configured. So if you click into it, what you'll see is that this is the actual dashboard. Now, there's a lot that you can do here, but before you actually do anything, the very first step is adopting your devices. So a lot of the times when you purchase a UniFi router, you'll purchase multiple devices. So you might have a switch, you might have multiple switches, you might have an access point, and there could be even more. The first thing that you should do is actually adopt those switches. So in the devices section here, you're going to see all the devices that are currently connected in some way or another to the router. So what I currently have is the access point connected to the 24-port PoE switch, which is connected to the aggregation switch, which is connected to the UDM Pro Max. So as you can see, everything pops up because technically, even though it's not all connected to the UDM Pro Max, the UDM Pro Max can see it. So the very first thing that we're going to do is actually adopt everything. And it's as simple as going through and selecting adopt. Now, as the devices are adopting, what you're going to see is that some of them might have updates. So after it is adopted, what you can do is click to update the device, and then it will run through and update the device, and we'll connect back as soon as everything is adopted and updated. Okay, so after everything has been adopted and updated, what you'll see is that everything has been assigned an IP address. You'll also know the type of uplink that it's using, as well as exactly which parent device it's connected to. Now, the very first thing I like to do is actually set static IP addresses for all of my switches and access points. But before we do that, what I'm going to change is I don't want to use the 192.168.1 subnet. So we're going to modify this, and we're going to modify the IP addresses of these actual switches and access points. So in the settings here, we're going to go to networks, we're going to select default. And now for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up this default network to be a management network. This will be for all of my switches and access points, as well as any of my server management interfaces, etc. So I'm going to change the network name to management, and then the IP addresses that I want to use is 10.2.0.1. So after I do that, I'm going to select auto scale network here, and this is just going to be so that we can change this DHCP server. I'm just going to set this to be 100 to 254. That's going to be more than enough. We're going to apply these changes, and after we do that, if we head back to the UniFi devices section, everything will slowly start to reset and get a new IP address. So at this point, it's been a few minutes here, but at this point, everything is now on the 10.2.0.1 subnet. So the first thing we're going to do is open this USW aggregation switch. We're going to go to the settings here, and then we're going to change the IP settings from DHCP to static. So I just quickly filled this in, and what I like to do is I like to start my switches at 10 and then basically just go up, and I like to start my access points at 40 and go up from there. So anything that starts with a 10 I know is a switch, anything that starts with a 40 I know is an access point. Never really need it, but that's just how I do it. The preferred DNS server, I like to manually set the DNS servers, and I like to use two different ones. I use Cloudflare as the main one and Google as the backup. And then the subnet mask is going to be 255.255.255.0. And then the gateway for me will be 10.2.0.1, but based on the subnet you're using, it will be whatever that subnet is, .1. Everything else here can stay as default. We're going to apply. And then what I'm going to do is I set this up for every single one of my switches and access points. So I'm going to come into here. I'm going to go into the settings. I'm going to change this to static, and this is going to be set as 11. And then as you can see, everything else is set as the same. We're going to apply that. So then the final thing we're going to change is this actual access point. And then everything else is the same as the switches. So we're going to apply those changes, and then the actual access point will reboot. So the main reason to do that is because there's two things it does. One, it ensures that your actual devices each have a static IP address. That's number one. Number two is that DNS is always a problem. In one way or another, DNS is always a problem. So by manually setting a DNS server, you can ensure that if you ever set up a DNS server and change some of your global settings to use it, and then you run into problems, that these devices are not going to be impacted by that. So that's the main reason why I like to do that. You don't have to do it, but that's what I like to do. So after everything has been changed, we're going to go back into the actual networks tab here, and we're going to start to create some of our VLANs. Now, VLANs are virtual networks. So I'm going to be setting up a bunch of them here, but a few things. The generic setup for most people is going to be a guest network as well as an IoT network. So based on your requirements, you're going to have to determine exactly which VLANs you want to configure. That's kind of the big thing here. For me, I'm going to have probably more than you'll have, and I'll explain them as time goes on. But the very first one we're going to set up is going to be a trusted devices one. So I'm going to set this to be 10.2.1.1, and then I'm going to change the actual VLAN ID to be 21. Now, this trusted devices VLAN is going to be for all of my computers, my laptops, my phones, stuff like that. I like to set this up separate from the management devices, meaning from your switches and access points. You don't have to do that though. If you have a smaller or you just want a more basic setup, you can use that first network for all of your devices as well as your computers, laptops, phones, etc., and it will work perfectly fine. I just like to have that additional segregation, but you don't have to do that. So again, this is going to be my trusted networks. I'm going to set the VLAN ID to be 21. And then what I'm going to do is I'm not going to auto scale the network, and I'm going to change this to be from 50 to 200. So I like to reserve some IP addresses in the beginning and IP addresses at the end. And then all these other settings are not going to apply to this specific network, but they'll apply to other networks moving forward. So we're going to add this. Now the next one we're going to set up, this is one that most people are going to have. We're going to set up an IoT network. I'm going to set it to be 10.2.10.1. I'm going to uncheck auto scale network. I will select manual. I'll change this VLAN ID to be 210. We're going to scroll down, and then for this one, I'll leave it at 254, and I'm just going to set it to be 50. So 50 to 254 is going to be the actual IP addresses that these devices will be handed out by our DHCP server, which is our UDN Pro in this scenario. So a DHCP server just hands out IP addresses. That's the easiest way to think about it. So in that case, these are the only IP addresses it can actually hand out. Now for this device, it's going to be a little different because we are going to isolate this network from everything else. So I'm going to select isolate network here. And what this will ensure is that this network cannot access any other network. So it won't be able to access our management. It won't be able to access our trusted, and it won't be able to access anything we set up moving forward. So I'm not going to do any content filtering. I'm not going to set anything else up. There are other settings here, but they're going to be unique based on your actual requirements on if you do or don't have to turn them on. But for most people, you're not going to have to modify any of this. We're going to select add, and now the IoT VLAN is set up. Next is going to be our guest VLAN. Now for the guest VLAN, I like to set up an entirely different subnet. So I'm not going to use the 10.2 that we were using. I'm just going to use a regular 192.168.10.1. This just shows that if for whatever reason I see an IP address like that in logs or something like that, I know it came directly from the actual guest network. Now in unique scenarios where you have maybe a small business or an enterprise environment, a net mask of 24 might not be good enough. So at that point, you might have to switch this to something like 16. But the point is, if you're going to have over 200 devices connecting to the actual network at the same time, you're probably going to want to use something that has a higher total number of IP addresses. But for a regular home network, a 24 net mask is going to be more than enough. So in the manual settings here, I just changed the VLAN ID. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this to be the actual guest network. So this will ensure that this device cannot actually communicate with any of our other networks. And then there are some other cool settings that you can use later, like captive portals and stuff like that, which we'll talk about later. But everything else is going to stay the same. So I'm not going to modify the actual DHCP settings because for this network, I'm not actually going to be setting any static IP addresses. So everything here is good. So I just saved that and then I created 2 more networks. The only one I want to talk through quickly is the actual surveillance network. So I'm not going to isolate this network because I want to show you later how the firewall rules work. But what I do want to show you is that you can actually disable internet access. So these are going to be cameras. I don't want the cameras to ever access the internet. So I'm going to uncheck this. Just keep in mind that if you need granular firewall rules, meaning let's say you wanted most of the devices not to connect to the internet, but you wanted some of them to be able to connect to the internet, you wouldn't be able to use this feature because this is kind of an all or nothing type thing. So I'm going to keep that unchecked, and then I just modified some of these other settings. So these are my main VLANs at this point. You're not going to have this many, but the point here is that you can set this up based on exactly what your requirements are. And these are the VLANs that I'll be using. Development is just for test devices, surveillance is for cameras, guest is for guests. IoT is kind of a catch-all bucket for everything. I feel like if I don't know what a device goes into, it goes into the IoT network. Trusted computers management is then the actual switches and access points. So at this point, my VLANs are configured. But what I want to show you is how you can actually utilize those VLANs on the actual switch. And then we're going to move over to the actual Wi-Fi settings where you'll be able to see how you can actually assign one of these VLANs to a Wi-Fi network. So we're going to head back to our devices here and we're going to click into the actual port manager for our 24 port switch here. And if you click on a port, what you're going to see is that this is the default setup. So by default, it is using the actual management network, and it's also allowing all other VLANs as well. So this is very important. Tagged VLAN management is very important. So let's assume that we wanted this specific port to go to a camera. What we're going to do is we're going to change this then to the surveillance VLAN that we set up. But also what we have to do is block all other VLANs. If you don't do this, technically that one port, while it's assigned to the surveillance VLAN, will actually allow all of the other VLANs as well. So that's something called VLAN hopping. This is how you can stop VLAN hopping. It's a security benefit to do this because you don't want this specific device to be able to go onto a different VLAN if it wants to. So we're going to block all the other ones. Now keep in mind that every single port isn't necessarily going to be like this. So if you had something like a hypervisor, for example, and you actually wanted those VLANs to be able to be tagged, you wouldn't be able to block all traffic. So you have to understand kind of how this works, but the main point here is that when you actually select the individual port, whatever you set it to here, that's the actual VLAN that this specific port will utilize. And then the tagged VLAN management here is how you'll determine exactly what other VLANs you want the actual port to be able to access. And yes, you can use custom. So if you wanted it to only be able to access the IoT VLAN, you could do that. So you have to understand how that works. That is a very important security feature. So now that we understand how exactly we can set up our VLANs to be utilized with ports on our actual switches, the next stage would be actually configuring this on a Wi-Fi network. So if you click the settings here and go to Wi-Fi, we're going to set up a regular WunderTech network here. We're going to set a password and we're going to change the network to be, this will be for my trusted devices. This is going to be my computers and my laptops. So I'm going to set this to be trusted, and then we're going to change this to manual. Now, there are a lot of settings inside of here. Most of these we're not going to go over. Most of these you're not going to have to worry about. Some of them are important, though, and those are the ones we're going to talk through. So the first thing that we're going to talk through is the actual Wi-Fi band. So this is a Wi-Fi 7 access point. That's why you see this 6 gigahertz here. If you don't have a Wi-Fi 7 access point, you're going to have 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. So for this specific network, I do want to be able to utilize the 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi band. So I'm going to turn that on. The other setting that's important here would be hide Wi-Fi name. So if you wanted this network to not be accessible when you take out your phone and search for Wi-Fi networks in the area, you could hide the Wi-Fi name. And then at that point, what you have to do is you have to go in and manually type in the actual network name as well as the password, and you'll be able to connect to this. Some people like to do it, some people don't. It's up to you. All of these other settings by default, for the most part, can stay the same outside of the security protocol. I like to use WPA2/WPA3 for compatibility purposes. If security is the most important thing, you're going to want to use WPA3 only, but for compatibility, I like to use this option. You don't have to, that's what I like to use. But after we do that, what we're going to do is create quickly a guest network where I'm going to come in here. This is where we'll select the guest network. And then I'm going to select manual here. And what I like to do for this one is I like to enable client device isolation. And this ensures that any guests that are connected to this access point will not be able to communicate with one another. So they'll be able to access the internet, but they won't be able to access anything else. For the guest network, I like to turn that on. The only other thing to talk through for the guest network would actually be a captive portal. So I came in and I typed in a password here, but if you enable captive portal, you'll see the actual password goes away. And what you can do is if you go into the hotspot portal, you'll be able to modify this. And then rather than typing in a password, guests will have to go in and log in through this portal. It's up to you. Generally for home usage, you're probably not going to use this, but in small business environments, you will most likely definitely use this. So it depends on your requirements. So I'm going to turn that off. I'm not going to let them use Wi-Fi 7 because I'm greedy. And then I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to add this. And the only other one I want to add is the IoT. And then for the IoT, the one thing I want to talk through is that a lot of IoT devices are older. So smart plugs, thermostats, stuff like that. A lot of them will run into problems if they attempt to connect to a 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi band. So I like to disable 5 and 6 gigahertz for the IoT network only. Everything else, again, can stay as default based on your individual requirements. And then we're going to add this. And at this point, we have 3 networks. Now, again, all 3 of these, if you take out your phone right now, would be accessible because we didn't actually hide any of the network names. The only other thing I like to do is turn on channel optimization, and I like to do it at like 4 o'clock in the morning. And then this will run through, and if you're on a actual channel that has a lot of interference, it will check and it will put that actual access point on a different channel. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, turn this on because then you don't really have to worry about it. But if you're somebody that likes to go in and scan the actual channel and put your access points potentially on different channels, then this feature is not for you. Now, if you stopped right now, you'd have a pretty sophisticated setup, granted, not nearly where you need it to be. And that's why we're going to move on to some of the security settings here. So the first thing that we're going to actually talk through is intrusion prevention. So in the security section, there's a few things that you can enable here. If you're somebody that wants to block ads, you can. It's as simple as just checking this off. And then you could decide exactly which networks you want ad blocking to be turned on for. Next would be country restrictions. There are people that like to block specific countries. So they'll come in here, select block, and what this will ensure is that in both directions, you won't be able to access this country and this country won't be able to access you. Remember that someone in that country can actually connect to a VPN and still connect technically to your device if they really wanted to. But until you get into port forwarding and exposing services, everything is blocked by default. So this is something that I generally don't do until later in the game where things are potentially exposed. But that's something that you can enable. DNS Shield, this is kind of a new feature, but this is DNS over HTTPS. If you're a beginner, don't start here, but this is something that deserves its own tutorial. I'm sure there's a ton of videos out there on it already. That is something cool that you can implement. And the same thing with a honeypot. A honeypot would technically just sit there kind of on your network and wait for actual traffic, and it could be used to determine if there's any malicious activity going on. For beginners, do not enable that, but something that you could look into. Now, intrusion prevention is the big one here. So intrusion detection and intrusion prevention. This is one of the things that Ubiquiti kind of has locked down in terms of how easy it is. You can select auto here, and by default, you'll have IDS and IPS at a notify level, which will basically notify you if it detects any unusual activity. However, you can go into advanced here, and then you can actually come through and modify some of these settings. So IDS, identity detection, is just what detects it. Identity prevention is what actually stops it. So if you want to notify yourself, so identity detection is notify. If you want to block identity prevention, you have to select notify and block. And then you can come in here and actually customize exactly what you want to block. So these top ones, these are some of the biggest ones that most people want. Denial of service, you might want to turn that on. Some of this other stuff you can check off as well. But the point is, you can come in here and modify these settings extremely easily. I used to use pfSense, and if you went in and tried to set up IDS and IPS on it, you're going to be looking at a few hours to really configure it properly, and that potentially is a minimum. With UniFi, it's so easy. Literally, it's this screen. It might not be as powerful as something like that, and that's what people will say, and that's not a wrong statement, but it's also not nearly as complicated to set up. So you can customize all of this based on your actual requirements, and that will be IDS and IPS. Port forwarding, this is really going to be where you create any of your port forwarding rules. If you're a beginner and you don't know what this does, I wouldn't start here, but this is how you can expose services to the external world. Just know that if you do that, you do want to go in here into the general and you want to set up some country restrictions at the absolute minimum. Now, traffic and firewall rules. I'm going to have a full video on this next week because I believe that this deserves a full video. But at this point, what I'm going to do is set up a simple rule. So I'm going to come in here and select create entry, and it's going to block our surveillance network from accessing our other networks. So remember, I did not turn on the isolate feature. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change app to local network. I'm going to change source to destination, and the source is going to be our surveillance, and then the destination is going to be everything else. Now, keep in mind that you could set this to be both directions if you wanted to, but for now, I'm just going to set it to be source to destination. You can set a schedule. If you wanted it to block at specific times, you could do that. For me, this is a very, very basic firewall rule. This is kind of where you start. The problem with this is that, as you could see, it's about as basic as it gets. We're blocking all traffic from the surveillance VLAN to all of our other VLANs. So you can go in and add this, and then at that point, you'll have a basic firewall rule. But if you come into the advanced section here, this is really where you can create very, very granular firewall rules. However, it requires more of an explanation, and I really don't want to get into that explanation here. So if you want to see that, subscribe to the channel. That video is coming. Now, just to quickly talk through some of these other settings, in the VPN tab here, this is where you'll set up a VPN. If you want to access services on your local network from outside of your local network, this is the best place to set it up. If you have a VPN server and it's not running on this UniFi router, you should run it here. This is the best place to run it. There's a lot that you can customize. A future video will be coming on all the different VPN server types and kind of what I use and what I like. But to be honest with you, there's a ton of them out there already, so you could check that out. Routing is an advanced tab. You probably won't be here very often, if ever, but this is where you could set up static routes and stuff like that. Profiles. If you wanted to set up a Wi-Fi speed profile for your guest network, for example, you can come in here and set up a speed profile. The downside is that it can only be a maximum of 100 megabits per second and a maximum upload speed of 100 megabits per second as well. So if you want it to be more than that, unfortunately, you can't right now. And then IP groups. IP groups are very, very powerful and used generally in connection with firewall rules. So we'll be looking at that in a future video. Everything else, you can kind of walk through this. You do generally want auto backup turned on. This will create backups. You can come in the advanced section here and you can modify any of these settings if you actually want to, as well as in the control plane here. You can come in here and determine when things get automatically updated. For me, 12 a.m. is probably not good, but I'll change that to, let's say, 2 a.m. on Sundays. We're going to apply that. And then you can come in here and modify any of these settings as well. So again, this is a beginner setup. This is basically as rudimentary as it gets, but the point is that this gets you to a point where you can slowly build on top of it with the understanding that firewall rules, which is arguably the biggest part of this, we have not gone over yet. So understand that. So as I said in the beginning of the video, this was a beginner's guide to configuring a unified network. We didn't go over everything, but the idea is that this will be the first video in a series of videos to cover almost everything you can do with a unified network. So if you want to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel. I hope that you got some value out of this, but if you have any specific questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. But other than that, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.